from One Northwest, and this is Chris Johnson from If People. And this is a session that we titled Collaborative Design Processes and Plone. The most important thing to probably know about us, although we'll introduce ourselves individually, is that we are both non-programmers. But we are nonetheless very active Plone consultants and very active in the Plone community. And so we've been spending a bunch of time lately sort of thinking about how Plone happens and how can we make that better. And we realize that it's not, it's hard to figure out exactly it happens, especially from the outside. It seems like magic. It's not obvious how to participate in it or how to influence it. And there are definitely some ways that it could be a little more open, a little more transparent, and a little easier to influence in ways that don't necessarily involve cranking out lines of Python. And so we thought we'd put together a session that would be a little bit of a conversation about that, and also a little bit of a sort of a treasure map for you all about sort of how do things work. And I guess the only footnote I'll offer that in advance is that this is definitely the opinions of some fairly knowledgeable observers, but shouldn't necessarily be taken as gospel truth from on high. That's what you'll get from Alex Leamy down the hall. But with that footnote, please welcome Chris.
Thanks. Thanks, John. And part of this exploration was, as John's saying, it's kind of like what we've managed to gather here. This stuff isn't really documented out there in terms of like how the community works. Some pieces are, some pieces aren't. Some of them are scattered around. And in terms of like why am I here? About a year and a half ago, we had some code we wanted to contribute in to improve user interface on search in Plone and search results. And John was like, "Oh, well, just write a plip, and then you can just stick it in there." We had a little product that does all these things. It was very nice, very easy, fairly simple. I was like, "Okay, that's great." So I finally get around to the process. I'm going to do this. I'm going to write a plip, and then it'll make it happen. And I get to the first step, and I can't do it, because you have to be a core developer to write a plip, and I'm not a core developer. I'm not even a developer. So how do we do this? And that kind of led off into this whole sort of conversation is how do you have non-developers participating in Plone? And in particular, when open source projects are usually pretty developer-driven, how do we have this sort of more diverse group of stakeholders who's actually helping out make it happen? Do you want to add anything to over here? So goals of the session, basically we're going to show you what we understand as to how the community, how the Plone community creates Plone the software. And we're hoping to inspire some ideas about how to improve this process. And we're looking to contribute to shared interest in the community in general in improving the process. Again, we're not stuck with what we have, we're just trying to shed light on it so it gives us more tools to work with. And then finally, recruit people who want to help improve the process. So this isn't something that just by talking about it, we have somebody who's appointed to do it. It literally is something we need to take up responsibility as a community for making better. So we're going to go through the process map, collaborative design, sort of from outside Plone community, something we might be able to take inspiration from, look at what all that means, and then have a conversation with the participants in the room.
Okay, so I think that open source seems kind of mysterious. I mean, people want to know, how does Plone happen? Is it an orchestra? Is there a conductor who's deciding what happens and then getting everybody to somehow, play in unison? Is there a written score? And the answer is not really. It's in my mind, it's kind of like an orchestra with a lot of really, really talented players. It doesn't have a conductor. It has some notion of what good music sounds like, but it doesn't really have a score written out, down to the last note. Yet somehow it succeeds at making something that is of remarkable quality. And I know a lot about the Plone community. I'm not that experienced in the wider world of open source, but I would put forth the idea that Plone is actually relatively unusual, although not globally unique among, as Alex likes to say, sort of top 2% open source projects. I mean, we're unusual. We do not have, unlike, we don't have a corporate owner, Sun, who's making OpenOffice. OpenOffice is a great open source project. It exists because they have a corporate parent that puts a lot of resources into it. Mozilla and Firefox, which are probably the biggest and most successful and best known open source projects out there, they get 70 million something, they get tens of millions of dollars per year in revenue through an advertising agreement with Google, which is awesome. It gives them tremendous resources and tremendous, they have a couple hundred people on staff. We don't have, unlike some other projects, we don't have the BDFL, or the benevolent dictator for life, he who resolves the unresolvable decisions and decides, listens to consensus, then makes a decision. And we never have. I mean, it's from the very beginning. The project was co-founded by Alex and Alan, and neither of them, even though they're both incredibly good at what they do, neither of them have ever been that inclined to, or really had the ability to sort of lay down the law and say, this is how it is, this is how it will be, everyone be quiet. That's not how Plone is. And most importantly, we don't have any in this community. It's really important. There is nobody whose full-time job is to focus on making Plone better. We don't have any programmers whose job it is to make Plone. We have a community of people who use Plone, who work with Plone, who sell their consulting time to clients. They may be in-house consultants whose job is to implement Plone in their organization. But the Plone Foundation has no employees. There's no one whose job it is to be accountable for improving Plone. Or more importantly, there's no one whose job it is to be, to be the Mike Robinson, to be the project manager, as Paul likes to say, the middle management of Plone. That's all something we do as volunteers, all of us together. And it's just important. And I think people don't realize that's the case because Plone is so great and we get so much done. So there must be people who are getting paid full time to do this, and that's not the case. So what is the case? The hippies on the West Coast, where I come from, have the notion of chaotic systems, which is say systems that combine both chaotic, unplanned aspects as well as a certain degree of order. And actually, this notion was actually created not by exactly a West Coast hippie, but by Dee Hock, who is the founder of Visa, the Visa card network. Most people don't really know how Visa works, but it's actually a very loose network of related organizations that has a few very simple rules, and yet, of course, is transacting billions of dollars in commerce, every day. And there's a whole sort of line of systems thinking about this, but the idea is that it's to recognize that Plone and many open source projects have this nature to them. They have some things that are structured and some things that are not, and from that tension emerges, the artifacts that we see. Sorry, can you move me up to my notes?
Yep.
So let's talk about the processes. What are the processes that go on in Plone? I actually have a handout.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually we have two handouts. Why don't we hand around both of those. We realized that there was no way we were going to get this information into any sort of intelligible slide. So this is the Tillamook cheese factory in Oregon, and we have a couple of handouts which are sort of meant to be read together. And again, these are not definitive statements that are written from above and handed down, but they're sort of Chris's and mine attempt to make some sense of the sort of tacit knowledge that we have. The first handout is sort of trying to, the one sheet is trying to basically place different processes like bug fixing, releases, the PLIP process, which is short for Plone Improvement Proposal, support, documentation, conferences, marketing, stewardship. All those are things that we do. Those are all processes that we have. Some of them are more defined than others. And we tried to sort of just place them in a map and show how they connected to each other and influenced each other. The second sheet is more of a narrative thing in which I try to explain just the facts. What's going on in this process, who is doing what. And in that, we sort of attempted to use a technique we've been using at One Northwest to sort of do project management lately called DARCY, which stands for, it's an acronym, it's not based on Darcy Hanning, the current Plone Foundation president, although that is a pleasing coincidence. But the idea is for every key project that you're doing, you need to know, who is the decision maker, who decides and resolves the unresolvable, who's accountable for making it happen? Who's responsible for doing the work? Often those are very closely tied. Who needs to be consulted and listened to and talked to, in order to make a good decision or to execute the project? And then at the end, who needs to be informed? Who needs to be able to see what's going on? And so I tried to break that down for each of the key processes that we currently have. And I'm not going to spend our very precious time together walking you through that. This document is also online on Open Plans, and you can search for it. But I thought it would be useful background to sort of the conversation that we're gonna set up. There's the diagram. I think the most important thing to understand is that these processes kind of plot along a couple of spectrum. Some processes are things that individual people do, or in very small groups. Some processes are things that we all do together. Some processes are relatively formal and relatively defined and relatively structured. Some processes are extremely informal, and in some cases that they may need to be that way. In some cases, they may need a little bit more formalization. So I just wanted to use this as kind of just a overall sort of sense of the landscape that would inform the conversation that we're about to have. Before we dive into that, our next segment, how are we doing on time here? Right on time, beautiful. Chris has had some, it's said that most innovation is actually just an idea transplanted from one domain to another. And so Chris has had some experience in working with non-software developers to solve collaborative design problems. And so he's going to share with us a little bit of story from the world of building design and architecture about some processes they use to solve some of these problems. And then we thought we would use that as a sort of framing to talk about what ideas we can beg, borrow, and steal from that.
Great. So there's we're going to start with an example, and hopefully this will sort of inspire some ideas for what we can do and how we can change our processes, but it's based on what's called a charrette. And the example here, hopefully a little bit relevant for us, is a data center charrette. This is a meeting that was convened by the Rocky Mountain Institute with the notion of having a whole system design for data centers. 3 days long, basically a sort of clean sheet model with no compromises on what they were building. And they really, instead of just sort of minor incremental improvements in what things are going on, actual major sort of leapfrog ahead in terms of what does a data center look like. So the problem is basically data centers. Transistor density is going up. You have more heat generating things in a very small space. So what ends up happening, for every watt of electricity consumed by the computers, you need 2 or 3 watts to cool the computer and supply it power. So you've got serious issues with energy, which of course has long-term implications in terms of energy security as well as stability. And then for every 10-degree increase in temperature, you're doubling the failure rate of the computer. So we want data centers to be available, and so we got to deal with this heat issue. So the solution criteria, basically, we can't just keep applying more brute force, right? More air conditioners outside and more, more fans, as the slide before sort of showed as a desperate attempt to deal with the heat issue, is not really helping solve the problem. We must learn to use energy efficiently. And in fact, the whole design of the system has to be built around the notion of efficiency, reliability, and availability. So instead of just a sort of optimizing single components of it, like the cost of a server, we're looking at a whole system here. So the notion of charrette comes from a French word, which means cart, originally derived from the practice of the design students who would be frantically working in the cart on the way to class to finish their designs that they were about to submit. As opposed to being something where we're sort of accustomed to working in our silo, right? Your institution, your department, your specialty field. This is really something that's cutting across silos, bringing people from multiple disciplines together. And the other big thing, and this was the free image that was available of a cartoon that you all might notice, but it's an old story of blind monks who are all experiencing an elephant. And they're each at a different point touching the elephant. And so someone's at the leg, and he says, an elephant is like a tree trunk. and someone is at the tail and it says, ah, an elephant is like a rope. And someone's on the back and says, oh, an elephant is like a brush. And you get the idea, and in the cartoon version of this, there's also a blind man behind the elephant who's saying, ah, and an elephant is warm and mushy.
It's not so good.
It's not so good, but you get the point. If we're looking at a system, the elephant being the system, if we're looking at just pieces of it, we all get a totally different perception. So in a charrette, the idea is get the system in the room, get the whole thing there and acknowledge it and work on it at that level. So really, it is bringing people together to work together. Oftentimes what this ends up looking like is a roundtable workshop. So in this case, in the Rocky Mountain Institute Data Center Charrette, they brought together about 90 people. And they really crossed a lot of disciplines: engineering, real estate, computer design. They had the folks making the servers who, they had the folks in real estate who knew about sort of costing of these things, HVAC systems, facilities design, the business people who were having to calculate ROI on all of the things that are going on. They brought them all together. And the result of this process was basically a design that reduced energy consumption by 90%, an order of magnitude in data centers with greater availability and stability and equal computing power. So essentially, if you can imagine just paying 10% of the electricity bill and having a more reliable server facility, that's the design they created. Beyond that, there was actually 50 major recommendations and then a whole slew of little things that can be done. So it came out with a blueprint for how you could go out and just build a new data center using existing technologies in most cases. Oh, that may have been a little. So, do you want me to keep going through this?
Yeah.
Okay. So what made it work? There's a few points here about the charrette process. I want to just sort of back up from the event itself and the story behind that and sort of look at what are the patterns there that were important for this collaborative design process. The first thing is it was a facilitated dialogue, right? You didn't just sort of sit all these people down and say, all right, get busy. They were actually facilitating dialogue around innovative and functional design, right? Both functional and innovative, right? We need practical in as well as sort of breakthrough. As well as the strategies to improve the results of design decisions. Okay, so, and I think this is an important one. I'm just going to say it one more time. Strategies to improve the results of design decisions. That means when somebody makes a decision to put something some way or to choose some component, that has an impact. And so how can we affect the way people think about those design decisions so we improve the overall impact? The other thing is the whole system thinking. Again, this is getting the elephant in the room case. And what that allows us to do is really consider what are the interconnections between the parts of the system, because we're looking at a whole. Obviously, we know that the more concentrated heat generating things that we have, the more ability to cool them down we're going to need. All right, well, what does that mean? What does that mean for energy consumption? What does that mean for the space? What does that mean for the airflow? You got issues around security, looking at the different pieces there as well. And then the other thing is seeking solutions that address multiple problems. So, and how does this, what I found myself asking is, how are these relating to Plone and in terms of what we're trying to do as a group? And especially this issue of addressing multiple problems, right? The vision for Plone 4, we've seen a lot of how this is about improved usability and improved speed. So what kind of things can we build in such that whenever a core developer is making a contribution, somehow there's something that sort of fires off that helps that decision and puts the emphasis back on usability and speed? Another key thing about this, and again, you're seeing everybody was brought together at the beginning of the process. We didn't say, okay, well, here's the experts in data centers. They're going to go make a plan, and then they're going to come present it to you, and we'll talk about it. Everybody came together and started with a clean slate. So, and we have a few processes in the Plone community, like the PLIPs, for instance, which, as a non-developer, I definitely hadn't really been connected to what that process was like or how to be involved in it. And so from my experience, it sort of things pop up on the radar when they're already kind of at a coding level, and then they start talking about, they get a lot of feedback from developers. But how can we bring people in earlier on in the process such that we have more diverse stakeholders participating? And the other thing that we noted in this, kind of trying to apply this collaborative design process in the Get Paid experience, which is a e-commerce system for Plone, is that it really helped us kind of aggregate the demand. So we actually spread out the cost by having different partners pay for what went into the collective cost for the project. So it helped find who needed that, and it helped put our resources together.
And it also helped ensure that the thing that got built was the right thing.
Right. Exactly.
So despite our attempt to make this really short, we are running a little short on time. And I do have sort of an exercise that I want to do. But I did want to share very briefly a couple of thoughts on sort of what are some of the gaps that we found, and we were thinking about our current processes. A lot of that is actually contained in the handout, but I thought I would just summarize it verbally. And this is, again, in terms of our existing process, where are the holes? The thing that's been on my mind a lot lately is realizing that, Plone has a large number of components. It's actually pretty good separation of concerns. Some of those components are really actively being worked on, and there's someone who's a champion for it, and they're really committed to evolving it. Some of them have owners either that are a lot less active, or in some cases there's not really a strong owner at all at this point in time. And not coincidentally, the components that we tend to have the most problems with and the most frustration with are the ones that aren't that strongly owned. And until I actually did some gap analysis on that a week or two ago, I don't think anybody had actually made that list. Secondly, the community doesn't really have, and this is the problem that Chris ran into with the PLIP process, is that we don't actually have a really good way to collect and discuss, sort of feature and functionality ideas, very high-level ideas, in a way that's very accessible to non-technical people, both to our end users and to our sort of average integrators, of whom I'm very much one. We have really good processes for sort of reviewing actual implemented working code. That's the back-end stuff, but we don't really have the equivalent front-end idea collection thing. The PLIP process itself is somewhat opaque to non-developers, in part because it's believed to be a front-end thing, but actually is a back-end thing. And the absence of the front-end thing causes a lot of misunderstanding and frustration, even among experienced people. We have a framework team who provide a lot of the back-end review, but their mission and scope of action is actually really quite narrow, and it's very much a back-end review of submitted code. It's not a the framework team was not designed and structured to be a very forward-looking, let's talk about the vision, let's, recruit and mentor people. There is kind of a gap there. And again, there's sort of a little bit of a misperception. People think, oh, well, that's the framework team's job. But actually it isn't. I mean, maybe it should be, but, that's not the conversation. Last year in February 2008, the foundation convened actually a rather unprecedented event for an open source project like this. We actually convened the Plone Strategic Planning Summit. Thanks to our very generous hosts at Google's open source program, we gathered about 50 people who were actually a pretty diverse set of stakeholders in the room for a 3-day, 2.5-day non-technical conversation where we did it was actually, now realized in hindsight, something of a charrette, although it was not explicitly focused on designing something, but it was focused on kind of doing an assessment of the lay of the land and starting that idea of a conversation among developers and non-developers. But that was kind of a one-time event. We got a lot out of it. There actually has been a remarkable amount of follow-through. Alex mentioned that in the keynote. But it was kind of a one-shot deal, and we really need to figure out how to create ongoing work on this stuff and more, better tools and tactics for distributed participation, because not everybody can fly to Google for 3 days in February, and even if we did, they actually couldn't accommodate us all because there are so many of us. And finally, the last gap, I think, is we don't really have very systematic processes for getting feedback, quantifiable, measurable feedback from the broader Plone community. The sort of little anecdote that proves the point is that Plone's Windows installer used to have a kind of a clever feature where when you uninstalled it, it would pop open a web page to kind of ask you, hey, we're sorry to see you go. Why did you uninstall Plone? Was it not working for you? Blah, blah, blah. Right now, actually, when that fires, it takes you to a page that doesn't exist anymore. It's bit rot, right? But it sort of shows the light. We don't really have very good processes for getting that routine feedback. And so those are some gaps that we've seen. I'm sure that you can think of more. And actually, we're going to use the balance of our time to actually let you do some thinking about that. And we're going to try to collect that. And so we designed a kind of quick small group activity. And actually, this is about the perfect number of people to do it. I'd like to very quickly break you into sort of 4 groups, kind of the 1, 2, 3, and 4. Hopefully, you have about 5 or 7 people in each group. And I'd like you to spend, we've got about 10 minutes left. I'd like to have you spend about 5 of those minutes, 6 of those minutes, just having a little conversation among yourself where you talk about some of these questions. What are some things that you can think of that would help us front load the design process a little bit more and get more input and more commitment and better sense of what the needs really are before we actually move off to writing code? What kinds of activities can the community undertake that will generate more engagement or participation from non-developers? And most importantly, who needs to be engaged in this conversation, and also what can you do? What could you see yourself doing, spending time and energy to drive these things forward? Because it's definitely true that open source thrives on people doing stuff. Saying we should do something is great. Saying we should do this and I'm willing to do it is even better. So why don't you sort of get in a little small group there, and I'll give you about 5 or 7 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about that. And we'll kind of collect ideas and we'll get them up on the wiki. Then we can go on to that, right?
Yeah. I don't know if you ever read that first thing there.
I assume that was a joke.
Yes.
Okay.
I was going to take it out, but I was like, nah.
Bring people together who are users of code. I mean, in some ways, just collecting information is actually not taking people off. It's a good place to start. Back to the media. I'm going to guess people too. Are there tools out there that when you guys are mentioning good satisfaction, is that something that can be leveraged to? Yeah, it's actually Google Apps. Well, people are allowed to ask, because that's the people feed those questions. Other people are well, I mean, maybe some way of
time, we actually do want to have a chance to actually close and talk about some next steps. So thank you. I'm really excited that there seems to be a lot of conversation happening. I'm sorry we don't have more time right now. But that actually raises the question of, obviously we did not just solve all of the process problems of Plone in 45 minutes. So the obvious question is what next? We've created a Facebook page where you can become a fan. No, I'm just kidding. We've actually created a group on openplans.org, which is the currently unofficial but rapidly becoming de facto standard collaboration space for the Plone community, thanks to the amazing people at the Open Planning Project. tinyurl/plone-process will take you there, and I would very much invite you to sign up for the project. And there will be an email list where we will report out your notes that we will type up and try to sort of start driving a conversation forward if you all are interested in doing that. Chris, you had some other thoughts about closing here?
I did.
I don't know. Do you?
No. And so the thing is, we are kind of like fleshing this area out as where we can start to connect to each other, because one of the things is we're not necessarily connecting as non-developers. So those of you who aren't developers and like really looking to say, hey, maybe this is a place I can participate in the community, there's a few wiki pages there that are related to this. So, and there's actually a list where you can sort of tell us what your interests are, your skills, what you're bringing, as well as what John mentioned.
Hey, Matt, what are the logistics on lunch?
It will be in Polaris,
Uh-huh.
but there's obviously not enough room for everyone in Polaris, so get your lunch, find your friends.
Is it going to be bag lunch again?
Yes, it'll be the same as yesterday, so
Cool.
maybe you could try a different bag, unless you're vegetarian.
So, show of hands, are people interested in kind of continuing this conversation over lunch?
Sure.
Yes? Show me some hands. Okay. Okay. Well, let's propose that we actually take advantage of our primo pre-lunch slot and get lunch and come back here and occupy, because we'll be able to defend the space against the traveling hordes. And so we can kind of continue the conversation and go from there.
Just to make sure, in terms of the people who are interested to participate, is there at least one person from each group who's going to come back?
There were several from us.
Okay.
Somebody in the room back there? Okay, good.
Cool. Great. Excellent. Well, we'll see you back here in a few minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Johnny, you gonna